Well, good afternoon or good morning, everybody, and welcome to the session to discuss the energy transition and what is or is not realistic, what's really happening, and some of the contradictory, if not counterintuitive developments on that front. My name's Gillian Tett. I'm with the Financial Times. The reason I've been pulled into this session to moderate is because about 4 years ago, I created a platform at the Financial Times called Moral Money, which looks at sustainability, named not because we're trying to be religious and pious or patronizing, but because we were trying to invoke the theory of moral sentiments by Adam Smith to provide a broader vision of capitalism. And in that position, as having set up Moral Money, we've written a lot about the energy transition and seen the good, the bad, the ugly, and the downright contradictory and confusing. The good news is that there has been an explosion of interest and activity, which has been accelerated by the Inflation Reduction Act and the fact you have a lot of money pouring into venture capital funds to basically ride that wave. Another bit of good news is, of course, we've had a number of the big companies make pledges on this front, and almost every boardroom we speak to has got some kind of policy around this today. Surveys come out showing 98% of boardrooms now have policies on sustainability, and I'd love to know who the 2% aren't who don't. So there's been a lot of progress, a lot of discussion, and yet, if you look at the actual numbers in terms of whether or not we're actually averting significant global warming, they are pretty darn depressing. We have a very small carbon budget, which will almost certainly run out in the next 10 to 15 years to prevent serious global warming. And in spite of all the discussion about money flowing to try and fund the transition, the International Energy IEA estimates it's going to need about $4 trillion a year to actually finance the green transition between now and 2030. Others put the number even higher. And thus far, although some of that's emerging in the Western markets, we don't yet have almost any of that in the emerging markets where it's perhaps most badly needed. So lots of contradictions. We're going to be having someone who may be known to some of you to come and talk to us at the end in a few minutes, Christopher James, who is one person who's been at the center of the fight around finance and green energy because he created a hedge fund called Engine Room Number 1, which went up against the mighty Exxon a few years ago, about 2 years ago, I believe, and it scored the most extraordinary victory, which he can tell us all about when he comes. He's actually just landed, I believe, in an old-fashioned plane, and will be here any minute now. But until he arrives to tell us about what activism means these days and what the fossil fuel companies are or are not doing, and why a hedge fund with a tiny stake can score such an extraordinary victory, before he arrives, we've got the fabulous Dina Powell-McCormack, who, again, is probably known to many of you, a long-standing employee of Goldman Sachs in many roles, was running the 10,000 Women's project for many years, went off to the White House, to the National Security Team for a number of years under Trump, and then went back to Goldman Sachs and has been doing the sovereign relations portfolio and also the sustainability portfolio. So, Dina, you've seen the issue of the green transition from the engine room, if you will excuse a pun before Chris gets here, in terms of what Wall Street is or is not doing. But you've also seen it from the national security perspective, which in many ways is dominating the conversation. So before I start asking you about the financial flows and about Goldman Sachs and about what's actually happening or not happening in terms of Wall Street and where the money is needed, can I start by taking a different tack and saying, when you were in the White House, you spent a lot of time dealing with the Middle East. In many ways, it was a core part of your portfolio. And now the issue of Middle East politics and green energy are colliding with COP28. Mm-hmm. Many people who are green activists are furious that a country like the Middle East, as a country like the UAE, could host COP28 How do you make sense of what's happening right now in the Middle East in relation to the energy transition?
Sure. Well, thank you, Gillian. I'm so delighted to be here. I'm praying that Chris gets here because 50 minutes of interview by Gillian Tent is a very scary thing. So we'll open it up, I hope, to the audience or something.
Yeah.
That's right. Actually, I've known and admired Gillian for so many years. She didn't do justice to the fact that, of course, she'd been the long-standing editor of the Financial Times, created these incredible platforms, and is now leaving to be the provost of Cambridge. So I want to just say, incredibly impressive. Incredibly, incredibly impressive.
Well, thank you.
Well, you know, I was actually just speaking with Ibrahim Mahmoud from the PIF, which is the Sovereign Wealth Fund of Saudi Arabia. And it's really remarkable to see how much many of the Gulf countries have recognized how important it is to invest in climate transition in a number of ways. From a very obvious perspective, you want to diversify your portfolio from the greatest asset that you have, but they also clearly see this as a strategic objective. In the Saudis' case, they are working on many of these giga projects, like NEOM, which is going to be a futuristic city in the kingdom, and you literally can't do that without investing in electric and solar and renewable. And so there's just a commercial opportunity that's an investment decision that's been made by the Gulf countries. But I want to just step back a bit and tell you an interesting story that one of the best global investors I know said to me recently. He said, as we look around the world and we think about where we're allocating capital, you look at China, while it's always been, of course, from a population, strength of the economy, platform that we invest in, but you look at the deteriorating US-China relationship, and you begin to just ask, you know, how is this going to play out? And should we be a little bit thoughtful of how much capital in our portfolio we have invested there? And then you look at Europe, and my gosh, I mean, I'm sitting with the foremost Soviet expert here, but you look at a land war in Europe. We had never thought about that happening. Obviously, the threat of a coming recession in Europe. And he said to me, can you believe it? We're looking at the Middle East as the stable region to invest. I mean, who would have sort of thought about it that way several years ago? And I think there are a number of factors and also some huge challenges. First, the Gulf countries that have normalized relations with Israel. This is really a remarkable thing, and I played a very small role in, working on the Abraham Accords. But when you think about the countries that have normalized, yes, there's enormous geopolitical and national security pieces to that. But the economic opportunities that are now growing are really not talked about enough. The trade and commerce. If you think about just those countries alone, 80% of the populations of those nations are under the age of 30. And so the next generation that is doing business together, building these ties, I think really is a huge opportunity. Second, obviously with the price of oil where it is, and because of the disruption of the energy markets due to the war in Ukraine, you know, a lot of cash for many years to come in that region, and how to think innovatively about investing that is going to be something to watch. And finally, you know, new leaders on the scene. Like all leaders, flawed, but one hopes beginning to recognize that in order for that young population that they're responsible for to have a future that they are happy and hopeful about, they have to start thinking about how to work well in the region. Just on this stage a few days ago, Her Highness Princess Rima said that they would very much like to begin to work more closely with Israel. And she said something interesting. She said, we don't want to just normalize. I mean, normalizing suggests coexisting. We want to be integrated. I mean, that's a remarkable thing to say with the ambassador to the U.S. from the kingdom.
Well, that certainly is a remarkable thing to say, and it's one of many remarkable things coming out of the region right now. But I mean, many people would say, and we speak to them, you know, in terms of the green activists, you know, we just can't believe that you can ever put the word green on anything linked with the Middle East because, you know, they have this dominant role in hydrocarbons. Very little sign they're actually, you know, slowing that down at the moment. They're still producing a lot of carbon emissions. You know, what on earth can green policies actually do there?
Well, there's green in the money they're spending. Right. and they are now the largest investors in green hydrogen, in in solar. The UAE just invested the largest, and you just wrote an article about this, in green hydrogen. And you see the Qataris and Saudis and others. Now, obviously, they are, of course, the source of most of the fossil fuel. And that is, and understandably, activists are wondering, are they the right messengers, if you will? But I heard Mike Wirth speak here. And he said, just a kind of very, I thought, honest thing, the CEO of Chevron. He said, everybody wants to head towards climate transition. Of course, it's the right thing for the world. And that's why they are simultaneously, of course, managing their fossil business, but also investing in new technology. But he said something pretty realistic. It's a little bit unfair for all of us who have access to energy sources to forget about the billions and billions of people around the world who don't. And how realistic is it for us to just hope that electric vehicles are going to meet the targets that they are, that all of these energies, you were in that article a little suspicious of green hydrogen. Many of these new technologies, we just don't know how they're going to develop, and we certainly know they're not going to develop quickly enough. So when you have a combination of just the realistic need for energy around the world, when you have a national security issue now with what's happened in Russia, every sovereign nation around the world is asking themselves, how am I energy independent? That is the most important thing today, whether you're Germany, and many of the mistakes, frankly, that I think they're saying that they made by shutting down their nuclear energy program, and you don't flip a switch and turn that back on. That's a decade. The pipeline that they agreed to with Russia, these have huge consequences on their economy and on their security for years to come. So I think this whole discussion is so important, but it has to be realistic. It has to be thought about from the national security context. It has to be thought about from developing nations and what access they have and what right they have to energy that's going to take them a lot longer and be much more expensive for them. And then I think finally, I think that if we reframe this, and certainly at Goldman Sachs, we reframed it in a different way. We said, stepping back, we know 98% of boardrooms. I sat in the management committee every Monday at Goldman Sachs. We talked about this issue. Why? Because every single one of our clients is thinking through whether they're directly impacted, like a Mike Wirth and Chevron, or you're a consumer products company. You have to be thinking about this. Supply chain issues, the whole issue of ESG. And so we looked at it as, who's going to get the greatest market share? If our clients care about this, what solutions are we helping them think through? How are we helping them as they think about capital allocation? Let's just do this as a way to think about this is the next industrial revolution. And I think where you're really going to see change is when people see the market opportunity. So we decided actually to commit $750 billion over the next decade in advising, financing, and co-investing with our clients. And I'll just give you a couple of examples. We were the largest investor, balance sheet investment, in Northvolt, the best battery company in Europe. We helped them scale their company dramatically. We also worked with Tim Cook at Apple and Conservation International. Thank God Chris is here. And Conservation International to create a fund, $300 million fund, we're the GP, to invest in new forestry technology. I'm no expert on this, but it's fascinating. There's new seedlings that are developing that actually trees grow much faster. And this was Tim Cook saying, even if I do everything I possibly can to get to net zero, realistically, it's going to take me a long time, given what Apple does. And so he's now saying, I've got to do way more than just that. Phew, just in the nick of time. How are you?
Good to see you.
It's great to see you, Chris.
Good to see you.
Hi, Julie.
Yes, hi. Wow, well, that's called How to Make a Dramatic Entrance, and we're all very, very pleased to see you.
Unfortunately, it wasn't supposed to be dramatic, but yes.
Right, well, we've all
Did you drive in an electric car here?
No. We're burning.
Or a hydrogen-fueled plane yet?
No.
I don't.
We're working on it.
They don't exist
Yeah, we're
yet.
working on it, but we're decades away.
A decade away. So actually, before we start asking about the meat of it, you reckon we're a decade away from a hydrogen-fueled plane or or clean aviation fuel? Because I've been very struck recently. I was in San Francisco the other day and looking at a company which have basically created a very clever technology to put hydrogen cells into the luggage compartment of regional airlines, and which means you can use the existing fleet, but just stick in hydrogen into the luggage compartments. And they're actually test flying them right now. So do you reckon it's going to be a decade until we get a hydrogen plane?
Yeah, I still think it'll be at least that long. There is a tremendous amount of innovation across the entire, whether it's sustainable aviation fuel. I was just looking at a sugar to jet A conversion plant that they're looking at putting in down in Louisiana. I mean, there are multiple ways, none of which we know exactly yet, to get there, but it will take at least a decade before we get there.
Well, that seems like a good theme to bring you in on, because the theme of the panel is to talk about what is realistic in the energy transition. You know, I think probably most people in the room would agree there needs to be an energy transition. We don't have a lot of time left. It's going to create a lot of money, but what is actually realistic about how fast we can or cannot move? So, as somebody, I've just been hearing from Dina talking about some of the contradictions around the Middle East today, and the fact it's simultaneously a massive source of hydrocarbon emissions, but also investing in green technologies now as well. Got the same paradox in Texas, of course, which has become the largest solar power generator in America, which some Texans seem unhappy about, but there we go. But tell us a bit about your battle with Enron, because you created Engineering Number 1 4 years ago, is that right?
2020.
2020, okay, yep. So
December 1st.
Okay, so almost 4 years ago.
Yep.
And just tell the group briefly what your mission was and whether you ever expected to win against Exxon.
We had this crazy idea that there was a real ability to drive value during the energy transition. And that yes, fossil fuels are going to be here for decades to come, yet the energy transition is actually really an incredible opportunity if you have great engineering talent, you have a mindset, you have a culture that's willing to experiment and fail. But if you have this huge engineering talent, you should be looking at this transition as an opportunity, and probably the biggest opportunity. And of course, remember Exxon, I mean, I always say this one, they invented lithium-ion batteries. They're the first person to ever scale solar. What we saw for the previous decade, previous several decades, was them fighting the energy transition instead of looking at it as an opportunity. Carbon capture, existing infrastructure. We're going to need, I mean, hydrogen, for example. Hydrogen, my guess is, ends up being used through most of the existing infrastructure that exists for fossil fuels right now. There's a lot of technologies right now that allow you to bind hydrogen and use existing infrastructure. We need them to play a role and to help drive the energy transition, or it will be incredibly slow. I do believe fossil fuels are going to be here for decades to come, which means we really need to focus on decarbonizing these heavy emitting industries. And if we don't do that, we are not going to be even close to our goals. Because we often think about, and going back, I mean, I'm sure most people know the history on this, going back to pre-Paris, we always thought about how do we hold countries accountable and how do we hold industries accountable to decarbonizing. At Paris, it effectively became easier just to focus on the supply side. Let's just blame the oil companies. And that's not originally how it was done in Bali. And so now we're in a situation where we've been focusing on the supply side. We need to focus on the demand side. We need to focus on how do we decarbonize demand. And unfortunately, that's been the refrain of oil companies, so that idea doesn't have a lot of credibility. But we have a situation where demand for power is about to accelerate and accelerate in a fairly large way because of the electrification of the whole world in combination with demand drivers like data centers and large language models. So we really do have to focus on decarbonizing the existing infrastructure and changing the demand side of this equation if we're going to have a real impact. I mean, there's a reason emissions keep going up every year. It's not working the way we're doing it right now.
Right, so as you say, emissions do keep going up every year, and that is extremely depressing. But just quickly, so you basically bought a tiny stake in Exxon. You did your campaign with the backing of groups like, I think, BlackRock and Vanguard came on board, and you won board seats, basically. Three board seats.
Well, 3 board seats, but it gets a lot.
And a lot of people were astonished, given how small your stake was.
Yeah.
A lot of people were astonished you won. You know, and so I guess the question I have is, firstly, have you actually changed Exxon's direction at all in any meaningful way? I mean, do you think you've actually achieved what you set out to do? And then secondly, you launched your campaign at a time when ESG was hot and when there was a real concern about green issues. We're now living through a period of backlash. We've had even Larry Fink saying on the stage on Saturday or Sunday that, you know, he doesn't use the word ESG anymore. Do you think you would win that campaign again now if you were to relaunch it?
Yeah, ESG has somehow become an ideology, and ideologies are very challenging on either side if you want to bring together a large group of people. The reason we were able to get the votes to win 3 board seats at Exxon, yes, BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, important to get them because they own 21% of the company. But each of the meetings that we had with all of those groups, these were not ESG meetings. These are meetings about how can this company drive value in the energy transition. I mean, that's what they're focused on, and they're focused on governance. Exxon didn't have not a single person with energy experience on the board. And so it was a fairly straightforward argument, which is we have 4 people, all of which who have successful experience in the energy sector, 2 of which have a very successful energy experience in the energy transition. You know, it was Anders Runevad, who has turned around Vestas. We had Kaisa Hietala, who started the biodiesel business for Neste, which became their biggest business. Of course, Andy Karsner, who all of you know, who is Undersecretary of Renewable Energy, and Greg Goff, who was the best CEO in energy named by HBR in the last 20 years. So it was very simple. This is a governance issue, and with with people with successful energy experience on the board, they can help management craft a strategy to be successful. And so my favorite stat was the quarter before we launched the campaign, they said the word carbon twice on the conference call. You always wanted to stay away from talking about carbon. Now they have since set up, reorganized the company. One of the key divisions is the low carbon solutions business. And in that, they're spending $17 billion to decarbonize their own operations. And I think a lot of this, there's been some really good academic work around this. Kelly Shue at Yale did this great piece, which is we have to have heavy emitting industry companies be successful, because when they're successful, they actually decarbonize.
Right.
If they're not, if you look at companies whose cost of capital goes up a lot in their gray industries, their emissions actually increase.
Okay, so divesting doesn't work.
Divesting is an awful idea.
Right. So you're better off basically getting involved and campaigning for change, actually, as part of that process.
Absolutely. Divesting or just doing negative screening with companies that don't have any carbon.
Right.
That doesn't have any impact.
So Dina, from the perspective of Goldman Sachs, when you look at something like the remarkable story of Engine Room Number 1 and how it did manage to, get the board seats at Exxon and then basically put carbon back on their agenda, their conference calls, if nothing else, and hopefully lead to meaningful transitions, do you see, other examples where that could play out too? Do you see heavy industry increasingly starting to transition? Partly because they're scared of people like Chris?
He doesn't look so scary. Of course, we see across the board, as I said earlier, such a focus on this. I was saying there isn't a client that by the way, I just retired after 16 years.
Congratulations.
Thank you, but I felt like I should say that. But extremely proud of Goldman. But yeah, every single client, as I was saying, our sovereign wealth clients, our corporate clients, large family offices. I mean, this is an issue they're extremely focused on. But they're also looking to us sometimes for more creative ways to approach the issue and more creative ways to find different kinds of capital. Gillian coined this phrase, blended finance, many, many years ago. The idea is that, yes, there's going to be investment capital. Sometimes it's just straightforward, investing in Lucid, for example. Sometimes there's going to be government incentives and government subsidies. But what's really lacking in the market today is riskier capital investing in projects in, frankly, geographies where there isn't enough of this capital. That actually is going to try to find the next Lucid. And so we were very proud at Goldman to actually partner with Mike Bloomberg and Bloomberg Philanthropies to create a financing facility with the Asian Development Bank. We were willing to put in grant capital as a first tranche, which now is leading the Asian Development Bank to raise $500 million on top of that to invest in things that, frankly, a Goldman Sachs wouldn't invest in, that governments wouldn't be as interested in, and particularly in geographies that are not as appealing today. And so our first investment is in what we believe will be the best electric bus company in India. Happens to be very small. They're testing the model. Really terrific entrepreneurs running it. But it wouldn't have cleared the hurdles that we had. And frankly, there weren't other sources of capital. And so I really do believe that this blended finance notion, or some people call it concessionary capital, we have to be creative across the board and look at different ways to incentivize companies like ours and others to do that. I'll shout out then Deputy Mayor Bob Steele, who's here. I think the Bloomberg administration, both in terms of in government, but frankly in what they're doing in philanthropies, is the model, bringing the public and private together. There's no more important issue today, frankly, that is as intertwined with government, capital markets, and industry as the energy industry is. And so it's just going to have to be a whole bunch of partners working together on it.
Absolutely. I mean, I guess one of the things that really sounded the death knell for David Malpass at the World Bank was the fact that a number of people have been yelling at the World Bank and the other multilateral development banks for a long time to take the lead in actually unleashing these kind of blended finance projects where you have public and private capital. It's a bit like imagining Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, where you have the government or another body underwriting or taking away the first tranche of risk so that other people can come in.
You remember we did that previously with Jim Kim at the World Bank. We had an initiative called 10,000 Women, which we supported female entrepreneurs around the world, and female entrepreneurs, particularly outside of the United States, get less than 0.01% of any kind of capital. And so Jim was very thoughtful about it. He said, I can't go raise capital, quite frankly, and support female entrepreneurs. There again, we put in $50 million. Today, that's $1.3 billion of capital that really serves as a credit line for banks in developing nations. The only catch is they have to give that capital, they have to lend that capital to female entrepreneurs. And guess what? There's almost a 0% loan loss risk and default rate. And so, I think you have to really get more creative, and multilateral institutions have enormous capacity to do that when a firm like ours was willing to take all the risk.
Well, it's going to be very interesting to see what Ajay Banga does at the World Bank going forward.
It's terrific.
And certainly, we have written a lot about the need for blended finance. But Chris, from your perspective, having gone head-to-head with an oil major and tried to turn the tanker, where do you see as the most powerful areas for you to deploy your capital now in terms of your activist campaigns? I mean, what do you want to go up against next? Or what are the parts of the industrial and business world which are not transitioning fast enough in your view?
Well, there are several criteria that we need to see in order to try to drive change. First, we have to have, if you're looking at an activist target, you always look for an outlier. And Exxon is an outlier in that it had incredible assets, yet had not the culture and the organization was not geared towards creating value during this decarbonization. Now, I think that the industry right now actually is doing a reasonable job of thinking about what role they can play. Now, I say reasonable because you have some countervailing issues. When we looked at, and we spoke to the board members, management teams of Equinor, of BP, of Shell, of the European majors who, as we see now, are changing course a little bit. And we looked at them and we interviewed, and what we realized was there was a conclusion which we didn't expect, which is we did not think these companies, with the exception of first movers in a particular area, were going to be able to earn their cost of capital in renewables. And so when we went to, when we first started this, we thought there was a path forward for Exxon within this case. After doing all these interviews, our conclusion was there wasn't, because if you're not going to earn your cost of capital in components of the energy transition or parts of energy transition, you will not keep your job as CEO. And then we'll see what happened to Shell and BP, where we switch back and forth between fossil fuels, renewable. So we have to figure out how we're going to create value. I think growth companies and at-scale growth renewable IPPs are going to be the people that actually end up doing this. There are several large-scale solar companies who I think will be capable of moving the needle across each of these geographies. And
are those American solar companies or Chinese or?
There's some American companies, some European companies. There's some companies in South America. I'm not super familiar with the obviously Asia is China in particular is putting an enormous amount of effort on renewables. But I think that the balance, I think we're going to see the oil and gas companies end up focusing on carbon capture, on hydrogen, on places where they have core competencies. And some biofuels, but I'm not a huge fan of those.
Do you think the fossil fuel companies would do better to simply hand the money back to shareholders and let a whole bunch of startups come in and do this instead?
So I think
as they essentially treat themselves as rundown businesses on a sort of 20 or 30-year timescale.
I think
I'm sure that's not a popular idea in this room, but it's certainly an idea that's been increasingly suggested to me.
I think they should be partnering with. They've never been great partnership companies. They're very challenging to work with. I think what they should be doing is they should be partnering with a lot of these companies who have very impressive technology, great entrepreneur management teams, investing with them and have them help them get to scale. Because the issue is scale. And when we're looking at this issue, we're looking at, so renewables are 20% in the US, right? So that sounds great. It should be easy to get to 40, except 8.5% hydro, 8.5% plus or minus is wind, 3.5% solar. So we can grow solar 50% for the next decade, and we're not going to be able to keep up with the demand of incremental new power. So we need solutions. This is why hydrogen is important. We need solutions that can scale, but we cannot see Exxon, Chevron's, Shell's. They can't make money in solar.
Wow.
I mean, if you look at how they build a solar project versus how an entrepreneurial company would build a solar project, it is so massively over-engineered. And the process, they think about it like a oil project, and that's just not the cost structure that's gonna make sense.
So what we should be looking at is lots of solar groups. Dina, from a national security perspective, does it concern you that so much of the solar capacity is in China? Because the vast majority of components are coming from China today, and most of the companies are China. And there's a sort of ghastly choice between whether America wants to decarbonize quickly and embrace solar quickly and dance with the Chinese supply chain, or basically try and go it alone?
Well, it certainly concerns our current policymakers on both sides of the aisle. You saw that with the IRA and the incentive package. And I think Mike Gallagher and the China Committee are actually looking at this as an issue because we learned during COVID just how much of our supply chain on critical industries, from our pharmaceuticals to semiconductors, chips. I mean, we really have learned the hard way that we have to be much more thoughtful about retaining those elements. I know it sounds like I'm quoting from a very good book called Superpower in Peril by my husband, a plan to renew America.
At 3:30 or 3 o'clock for anyone who wants to come and listen to that.
Yes, if you'd like to hear more, come at 3:30.
Dina's husband, yeah.
Yes, I didn't want him to think I was plagiarizing, but it's true. I think we've had such a wake-up call. And actually, you know, sadly, the U.S.-China issue today has obviously become a political football. I mean, we just have to say it. The most bipartisan thing today in Washington, D.C. is, you know, who can stand up to China more? And you're going to see this as an issue increasing as we get closer to the presidential election of 2024. And that's, frankly, in some ways, you know, can be concerning. You've heard Dr. Kissinger talk about how careful we need to be given the size of the Chinese economy, but it's also a wake-up call. For 40 years, both Republicans and Democrats took a view that if we let China into the WTO and part of the international economy, they would reciprocate, they would allow our industries in, they'd give us access to their markets, and quite frankly, it didn't happen. And I think we also didn't predict Xi Jinping. I mean, Xi Jinping is very focused on one China. And you look at, I mean, what he's done, obviously, in Hong Kong and what he talks about in terms of Taiwan. So I think this is a very serious issue. And I do think policymakers are finally, and I would say in a somewhat bipartisan way, recognizing that there are industries we have to decouple. We have to start being much smarter about what we're producing in the United States for our own security. I'm going to turn this around on you, and Kitty Boone may never invite me to speak again. But I think if we're going to talk about national security and energy, we have to ask Jillian about the latest developments in Russia.
Oh,
and so just give us a couple. I mean, because you can't have this conversation without what's happening to Putin. You lived in Moscow for how long?
I just say briefly that, you know, Russia is turning into a gas station with you know, nuclear weapons. I mean, that's the main thing, and that's the main thing driving the economy. And unfortunately, the oil revenues have kept going into Russia in spite of the sanctions, the very leaky sanctions. India and China are obviously buying a lot. I don't see a lot of stability emerging in Russia anytime soon, which is going to put the focus back on energy security for the rest of the world, big time. And Russia is notably not investing in renewables, as far as anyone can tell, anytime soon, in sharp contrast to Ukraine, who, as you know, the Ukrainian government representatives met in London last week. And, you know, their top pitch for almost every infrastructure project was how it was going to be green. And they've discovered things, I mean, tragically, they've lost a hydroelectric dam, and that's knocked out a large chunk of their renewable energy. They've also lost a lot of their other renewable energy has been bombed, but they've worked out recently that actually having solar and wind stations powering electricity is actually rather more resilient if you're facing rocket attacks, because if a rocket attack takes out the big hydroelectric station or the big power station, it creates devastation. Knocking out a whole bunch of wind turbines spread over, you know, a whole area is a lot harder. So, you know, rather interesting wrinkle, or rather of the tragedy of war. Yeah, but I'm curious. So the solar supply chain is very heavily Chinese. Even the wind supply chain is not very American, is it?
No.
I mean, there was a fascinating documentary from Tucker Carlson that came out last year, one of the Tucker Carlson's originals, about wind turbines. And I watched it just before going to the COP26 in
Egypt.
No, the one before that. So 2 years ago.
Yeah.
It came out 2 years ago.
Sorry.
Just before the COP26 in England, in Scotland. And everyone involved in anything green assumed that wind turbines were so uncontroversial that they slapped them on every single bit of branding they had. Every single picture of COP had a wind turbine on it, because people thought that they were like, you know, motherhood and apple pie. No one can possibly object to a wind turbine unless you are Tucker Carlson, who basically put out this enormous documentary saying how evil wind turbines are, because they are mostly produced by the Danish, and they are invading America in a kind of rerun of the Vikings. I'm not kidding. You can still find it online on YouTube, the Tucker Carlson documentary on wind turbines. But there's actually, I mean, seriously, they have a whole section on scary Danes and scary Scandinavians coming in with their wind turbines. Serious question, though. Do you see a lot of opportunity, though, for someone like you to get involved in investing in that? I mean, would you counsel people in this room when they're looking at their own investments to jump into the renewable energy sector?
It is going to be growing for decades to come. The area we have actually been focused, when we look at the entire system, what are the bottlenecks that we have in order to hit our goals? The biggest bottleneck is as I talked about this last Aspen conference last year, is permitting. Permitting. Yeah. Getting projects done. I was in Wyoming last week when they finally started construction 13 years after they applied for permit on the transmission line from Wyoming to the Western grid. So it's going to
13 years.
13 years. It's going to be 19 years from the time they started the project to the time they connect the wind farm in Wyoming to California. 19. It's 8.3 years to get an interconnect in California for a solar farm. So these are the practical realities of what it's going to take. The other component of this is critical minerals. Speaking to Dina's point, there is a mad rush right now globally in order to secure supply of critical minerals. And it's not just cobalt, it's copper, it's rare earths, it's
lithium.
Manganese, lithium, which we are in short supply of this entire decade. And unfortunately, there hasn't been, CGEP did a good piece on the critical minerals just recently. But if you look at just what the lithium mines that we know will be in production in the next 5 years, that we do not have enough lithium to hit, if you add up all global targets for EVs, if you use the 2030 target, we'll have enough lithium, best case, for maybe 60% of those cars, 70%.
And that's globally.
And that's globally. And on top of that, we have battery storage, which we cannot build out renewables in the grid past 30% without large-scale battery storage, which requires a ton of lithium. So I think and China is very aggressive throughout all of Africa right now, securing critical minerals, and much more aggressive than the Europeans and the US.
Right. Well, in fact, the session I just did earlier was on this very topic. So, yeah, if anyone feels like creating a lithium mine in America and you can get the permitting, go for it.
Well, actually, to Chris's point, though, on the issue of lithium, it's really fascinating that the G8, I mean, they're all these new MOUs it was at the top of the agenda. How do we help Japan? How do we help some of our allies mine lithium and partner with us on it? I mean, we're even now talking about it on the multilateral stage, where, as a critical issue.
Yeah, and we have been working on a couple deals on this space, and I have been amazed. I've never seen government intervention in the way that exists right now across these particular issues. We have, of course, the Indonesian issue, which is a complete, it's just a complicated situation. We have Canadian nationalism of right now of their critical minerals. We have actually the Japanese have just been activated. The trading houses have just been activated to the big auto companies to, can you secure all these critical minerals for us? And so, like, you have multiple parties who feel that if they don't have direct source, that is an existential risk to their own country's business.
Yeah.
And it is.
And guess who was thinking about this way before we were? The Chinese.
Yes.
And that's why they have been so invested in sub-Saharan Africa. I mean, they have been thinking about these critical minerals. One Belt, One Road was not just an altruistic, development program. They were very strategic about the investments they made in many African countries so that they would have access to those minerals.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, and the question about whether the current administration is willing or able to act on the permitting issue to actually accelerate the development of lithium mines in America is going to be critical.
And the processing of lithium is nasty. I mean, the reason we don't have lithium processing is we could have never got it permitted here.
Permitted, yeah. What about hydrogen? Because I'm going to go to the audience for questions in just a second. But what about hydrogen? Now, again, from the perspective of moral money, we can see what readers of the FT care about at any given time. So, we can see that in terms of what they click on stories and how enthusiastically they click, and then they send me angry emails and stuff. So 2 years ago, Beyond Meat, impossible. Everyone loved, cows are the new coal, stranded assets, blah, blah, blah. And so everyone was about that. In England, they have constant fashions about wilding and things like that. But the one that's really hot right now is hydrogen. Every time we write about hydrogen, we've just done a huge series on hydrogen, we get huge numbers of hits. But the question I have, is that overhyped? Because I went to the port of LA the other day and saw hydrogen trucks with Toyota, and they're busy developing them with Shell and people like that. You can actually fill up a hydrogen truck and they're all whizzing around everywhere. But is it for real? You say 10 years until we get hydrogen planes. How soon do we get hydrogen trucks? Because there are companies out there saying we're going to have hydrogen trucks in 2 years.
We'll have them. We just don't have the infrastructure to allow them to be able to work effectively throughout the country. The way it exists right now, you have to build a new infrastructure for hydrogen. There are some really cool companies who have. There's one that I'm under NDA with that they have a molecule that allows you to bind hydrogen and use the existing infrastructure, pipeline infrastructure, to transport it so you don't have the issue with the hydrogen leaking out the pipes. And then have a catalyst on the other side allow it to convert. I actually think the easiest uses of hydrogen are within converting refineries to effectively large-scale battery storage, because they already have big interconnects, and we know interconnects are the big issue. They have storage. You have the ability to do this. We have to be relatively creative about this. I think within transportation, it's going to be hard. It's going to be hard because of this issue around how do we deliver hydrogen to all the parts that we need to in order to have them have effective refuel stations. If history is any guide, it's not something that we're going to see this decade. Ships, places where you have big hubs, but trying to get that infrastructure built throughout the U.S.
Not going to happen. Right. Hence the fact that you drove here on your regular car. Right. We got time for a few questions. As you know, the session has been extended for the full 50 minutes. So, a question there and a question over there. We got about 10 minutes left.
Hi, I'm Bart. I'm the head of Aspen Institute in Poland. My question relates to a country that's been mostly omitted throughout this festival, to Ukraine. Do you think that Ukraine may become an interesting investment destination after the war ends? And how would you advise the government of Ukraine to make their case for making their economy green? How could they, show that their energy sector will become resilient to attacks?
I'll just share a few thoughts from a perspective. We had actually at Goldman Sachs engaged President Zelensky and his economic team. I think he is obviously trying to be as focused as possible as rebuilding. As you know well, right before the start of the war, they had spent many billions on infrastructure investments and projects and basically rebuilt the entire infrastructure of the country, which has of course been destroyed. There are a number of global financial institutions, and we're proud to be one of them, that are actually helping him as he thinks about setting up a sovereign wealth fund, as he thinks about attracting capital. One of the issues is that obviously he's got to be very careful and transparent. Many billions of dollars from around the world are being invested. Again, I know Gillian is smiling a bit because there are questions about how those funds are invested and at the size and scale of that. I have heard some senators talking a little bit cautiously because of this kind of model that happened in Iraq, and we learned later we had to be very careful with government aid going into that. So I'm hopeful that his approach so far has really been one of, I'm realistic. I know that we have many years of sadly, conflict and then starting to talk about rebuilding, but he doesn't want to waste time, and he's trying to continue investments in the country, and we were very proud to try to help him. You might comment.
I'll say just a couple of things on that, because I've been to Kiev a lot, and I've been to Kiev quite a few times since the war started, and I'm going back there again soon. And I spend a lot of time talking to bits of the Ukrainian government. They are very, very keen indeed to embrace green infrastructure. Partly because they believe in it, but also because they've realized that that's going to be the fastest and easiest way to appeal to getting lots of money from the European Union and to present themselves as a greenfield site in every possible sense. So they are absolutely all in on it. They're also all in on trying to combat corruption. They know what their dreadful reputation is. There's something called DIA, which is a way of essentially using digital links to track where money's going, which could potentially provide a lot of transparency. The last thing I'll say is a little known detail about the Ukrainian conflict, which people probably don't know in this room, is that the reason why Prigozhin went straight for Bakhmut and Soledar was because you've got large concentrations of rare earth minerals in the east of Ukraine, in Donbass and Donetsk. And they're not stupid. Prigozhin knows which way is up. And actually, at the moment, the biggest concentration of rare earth minerals in Europe is sitting in the areas that Prigozhin went straight into. Just look at the map. I can tell anyone about it they want, but that's absolutely crucial to understanding why Putin is so determined to hang on to the Donbass and regions of Donetsk, and why the Ukrainians are very keen to get it back. There's a lot of money sitting under the ground, and a lot of stuff that's very critical to the things that Chris is talking about.
Right.
Question at the front here. Oh, over there and then over there. So,
what's your sense of the future of nuclear power?
Well, I was just having a conversation with CEO of the largest supplier of this. So. SMRs have, in particular, a lot of noise around them right now, the small modular reactors, which hopefully can be built on budget and on time. As you know, the last nuclear plant built in the U.S. in Burke County, Georgia, was Vogtle. Vogtle started as a $12 billion project and is going to finish as a $34 billion project. Which is why we've seen the other people in the U.S. stop building nukes. SMRs, the question I asked him was, what's the earliest we could see an SMR operational in the U.S.? And this is incredibly critical because they come in at roughly 300 megawatt. So they're coming in at sizes that can start to have an impact. The earliest he thinks we could see is 2030 to have one in operation. And he said that's an absolute best case. And they're involved. I mean, there's basically you have GE, you have Westinghouse, you have Terra Firma, which is the Gates-backed one, and you have, which of course can only use uranium from Russia, which so it's kind of on hold, and NuScale. And we've looked at all these companies, and the companies that we have seen looking at these, like TVA, are now having to reassess what their plans are. And as I always like to remind people, if it took 13 years to do an environmental impact study for a transmission line, what do you think permitting is going to look like for a nuke in the U.S.?
It's worth saying that, again, I mean, I'm strongly of the view, for what it's worth, that nuclear should be part of any kind of renewable energy solution, but one part, not all of it. And one of the tragedies, or many tragedies, of the current events around Zaporizhzhia in Ukraine is that there's a real risk that if there is an accident in Zaporizhzhia, it will set back the appetite for the Europeans towards nuclear for a long time. Fukushima was bad enough, but basically almost no one died of radiation in Fukushima, and that, in a sense, there's a feeling that sentiment has recovered from that. But if Zaporizhzhia has an accident, that's very bad news for the industry, or rather, if it's destroyed by the Russians. We got a question there, and then over there. So, lady there, and then
Chris,
you have your microphone there.
Chris, you were talking about a binder to allow hydrogen to be in the pipes. Are you able to use that same binder in transportation for hydrogen?
Yes.
Well, good.
Yeah.
Well,
It's a molecule that's been developed that then also has its own catalyst to be able to bind and then transport, and then all at reasonable temperatures.
wow, this is exactly the kind of nitty-gritty engineering conversation that matters so much right now. It's a very good time to be a geek.
Good question.
A question over there.
Hi, Chris. Charlie Dent, former member of Congress from Pennsylvania with the Aspen Institute. I established the Hydrogen Fuel Cell Caucus in Congress in 2005. Glad to see it's making a comeback, but my question is not about hydrogen. Grid capacity. As we electrify the transportation fleet, as we want to bring more manufacturing back, for chips, I worry a lot about the capacity of this grid and, the permitting issue we talked about, getting more transmission lines, and, I've been through all that in my career. How vulnerable is this grid? I really worry about blackouts, brownouts, and a lot of people want to do a lot of things. We talk about how we produce the electricity, but we don't really talk about how we move it.
Very, very good question. It is a serious problem. I was talking to a company who told me they have there's a 4-year lead time on transformers right now, and it's a fairly fragmented market. Well, it's basically 4 or 5 players. Transmission. We were talking to a company that is building a new data center. And the data centers, which historically have been probably the biggest incremental source of demand, the data centers that are being built now, they used to be 15, 30 megawatts. The data center footprint for a couple of the bigger guys was 100 megawatts. There's a RFP out right now for a 2.5 gigawatt data center area. And they're finding that there are so few places to do this because of transmission. So we're going to see a lot of heavy processing, I think, move behind the meter, but because of this. So we're going to have processing move to where generation is, instead of having it be where they necessarily want it to be because of this. I mean, PJM's 2.5 years. And the value of an interconnect now is extraordinary. And we've seen some really crazy deals that people are looking at in order just to buy an asset solely for its interconnect. I'm not super optimistic that we're going to solve this problem soon. I mean, California, where I live, is awful. PJM is tough. Texas, we've had some political lobbying around there, but we are seeing generating capacity move to Texas. Processing power move to Texas just to be near generation, so they don't have to deal with all the interconnects and the transmission issues. I can't stress enough that there is zero chance that we hit our 2030 targets unless something dramatically changes on transmission. And a little known fact, which I didn't know, I think it was under the Obama administration, they gave the government federal powers on right-of-way for transmission. It has never been used.
Wow.
And why? It's never been used because when you do this, you basically managed to start a battle with the senators, and you understand this dynamic better than me. This is how
So does Congressman Dent.
Yeah. But we have the ability, the federal government has the ability to do it, but no one's ever exercised that power.
Right. Sadly, very sadly, I can see a number of hands waving desperately, and I'm sorry. I'm sure you can all grab Chris afterwards and Dina and ask some more questions. We are out of time. Because we were started late, this room is going to be used quite soon for a session on the Supreme Court, which is slightly timely today. But anyway, I mean, it's been a fascinating conversation. 3 takeaways from my point of view. 1, there is a lot of activity, commitments, discussions, and focus on this, which is really encouraging. You know, even in places like the Middle East, even in Texas, even elsewhere. Secondly, the logistics and obstacles are absolutely extraordinarily daunting. I mean, you've touched on a number of them, Chris, and I think that trying to be realistic about the time scale is absolutely what we need to be doing now. But thirdly, it's clear that a lot is happening. A lot of the stuff, we've moved from the big, statement gestures around the climate to really worrying about the nitty-gritty of permitting and transmission and lithium supply chains and questions like that. And of course, that's without even talking about solar in the Middle East and elsewhere. So in some ways, the very fact that it's got so geeky is a very good sign. And let's just hope that the geeks are going to be able to deliver enough before we run out of time. So thank you all very much indeed for a fascinating conversation.
Thank you.
And Chris will be here.
Thanks, Jillian. Thank you.